Hello and welcome to the Parker Files, where today we're going to be taking a look at the Hot Toys Captain America MMS 536. This version of the figure comes from the movie Avengers Endgame. If you're new to the channel, there'll be more Marvel 6-scale figures and diorama reviews coming your way, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss those. And between now and then, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this figure as well, so please take a moment and leave a comment below. For the packaging, once again, Hot Toys have done a masterful job keeping the continuity of the Endgame line, and yet still maintaining individual branding around each character. Throughout this line of figures, I love how they've incorporated the Avengers logo and some spacey layering into the images of each of the figures, but to me, this one stands out a little more than the others. The image of Captain America looks fantastic in and of itself, and the symmetry of the A on his helmet and the A of the Avengers is the perfect metaphor of Cap being the embodiment and leader of the Avengers. The coloring on this box ties into this figure perfectly. The reds and blues are darker muted tones with brighter highlights, and the Avengers Endgame logo stands out in perfect position to cap off the artwork. The back incorporates more of the galaxy layering we've gotten on all the Endgame line with more of the Captain America color branding, and I really like the look of it. For accents, the outer sides have cutaways that reveal both the Captain America shield and the Avengers logos in reflective gold, and there's also a small shield on the back of the box. I always look for those types of fine details in the artwork, and I appreciate how Hot Toys continually indulge me. Pulling off the outer box reveals Cap's shield on the front, and on the back of the box, as always, we get the credits to the cast and crew who bring Captain America to our shelves, and a large faded Avengers logo. Alright, that's enough about the packaging. Let's open it up and see what's inside. Here we have Captain America out of the box, and I have to say, this is a figure that I almost passed on, and I'm so glad I didn't. I already had the Civil War version of Cap on my shelf, and for a long time, I thought that figure was going to be a hard version to beat. I love the coloring of that outfit and the fact that the shield was die cast, and on top of that, the head sculpt was already great, and I used it on a civilian Steve Rogers. So as far as Cap goes, I was good with what I had, and then, well, you know how it is. The figure you can get always seems better than the one you already have. And in this case, well, it is. And not just because it comes with a lot of accessories, which it does, but because this figure feels like it addresses so many of the issues that other versions of Cap had, and like the Mark 85 that we've already looked at, it feels like Hot Toys got it all right this time. The moment I pulled it out of the box, I said, that's America's ass. So first reactions are high. Starting from the ground up, the boots are a split cut design, which is always great, but sadly, they don't have as much articulation as you'd want to get from them, nor are they sturdy enough to ensure that he'll stand on his own in some more dynamic poses, which you'll see a bit later, and it really is my main issue with this figure. That said, the boots are nicely sculpted, and while this boot is just a variant of the same style boots we've gotten with all the other Cap figures, and even though there isn't as much weathering in the paint app as I would like, I still think these boots look great, and I love the detail in the straps and the buckles, and the look of there being different materials used on the boots themselves. The material on the legs is a rubbery style vinyl material that has some texture to it, which adds some nice realism, and it looks fantastic. This material is very different from what was used on the Civil War version, and it's unique to me in that I don't have any other figure in my collection that uses this type of material. So while I'm unsure as to how this will hold up over time, due to the ankle issues mentioned already and the articulation limitations of this figure, which I'll point out shortly, I don't know that I'll have him posed in such a way that that unknown will become an issue for me personally. The texture and color of the main parts of the pants are woven together with contrasting burgundy material, beautiful stitch work, and subtle weathering details which complete a realistic look almost to perfection. But what I don't like about the pants is actually the knee pads. Their shape is screen accurate and the texture and detail add to that realism, but what I don't like is the way that they're attached to the material of the legs. They sit a little too wide for my liking, and from certain angles, they appear crooked on the stitching of the pants. I also have concerns of them coming off over time if the figure was left in a dynamic pose, and while I don't intend to do that, I do wish Hot Toys would apply these knee pads with Velcro as they did on the shoulder pads of the most recent Ant-Man release. While the lower body is different from other caps we've seen, the upper body is where the differences are most notable and noticeable. The first thing to point out is the body proportions. I didn't notice how off the Civil War version was until I had this one in hand. The traps are more defined, which allows the straps to hang more naturally. I'm so glad that Hot Toys addressed the issues with the buckles on the straps of the D23 release of this figure. These straps are screen accurate and are nicely detailed. The buckles are the right size, thankfully, and the small clasps are a nice silver that stand out in contrast on the figure, and the main clasp on the back is die cast and it finishes off the look as it should. Speaking of finishing things off, one of the things I love about Endgame as a film is that it closed off the Iron Man and Cap story arcs perfectly. But I also love that their respective looks in the film capture their iconic comic looks perfectly. That's the main reason I went for this release, and it's most noticeable due to the scales of the chest piece and shoulder pads. The sculpts are perfectly done, and while the silver brushing in certain areas seems off up close, from a distance it adds a subtle realism that really works for me. The star looks fantastic and iconic as it should, and the paint app is exceptional, as is the detail of the darker wash and texture surrounding it. The chest and back tapers down to the waistline in that realistic V-style proportion, and while the ab section is reminiscent of previous looks and releases, I love the weathering used here. The white and burgundy are more muted and dirty, which is a perfect middle ground look for any display. The belt and gloves both appear to be the same sculpts as the Civil War version, so while I've seen them before, they do have a different paint application, and they are still both underrated pieces of the uniform in my opinion. The belt is consistent with the straps in terms of overall look and materials, and the pouches are nicely detailed in sculpt and in paint application. The gloves are equally well sculpted, and the paint app uses a brown and a black that complement the rest of the uniform nicely. The arms incorporate more of the rubbery style vinyl that's found in the pants, and while overall I like how it looks, my issue is that it looks a little too bulky in certain areas and in certain angles. Part of that is due to the rigidity of the material, but it's also due, in part, to the stretchy fabric used in the elbow and shoulder areas. I love this design for articulation purposes as it removes the potential for damage to the material, but at the same time, it makes the other material appear more puffy and pronounced. That said, one thing I do appreciate here is that the arms rest closer to the rest of the body, which is more natural and realistic looking in a museum pose as seen here. The elbow pads are similar to the knee pads in every way, including my concerns for them, but these concerns are overshadowed by the overall look of this figure. The scales, the layers, the colors, this just looks like Captain America, and even though I don't like everything about it, I love this figure. Especially this helmeted sculpt. Again, I was happy with the Civil War version until I saw this. This is a completely new sculpt and it's jaw-dropping in hand. The sculpt work is by far the best we've gotten to date, as is the paintwork. The weathering on the helmet is exquisite and it's in perfect proportion to the weathering on the figure overall. The way the neck of the costume sits right under the jaw, the look of the eyes through the helmet, and the way his chin sits in the strap, all of these components embody a subtle realism that speaks volumes. This is Hot Toys at its best, and this is the best Captain America head sculpt we've gotten to date. And so, for a rating of this helmeted Captain America sculpt, I'd give this a perfect 10 out of 10. In terms of accessories, while this figure doesn't come with everything its D23 counterpart did, it still comes with a lot, and I'm glad to see and say that Hot Toys addressed the issues with what they revealed originally, and as a result, all of these accessories exceed my expectations. First up, we see Cap's iconic shield. Many collectors were annoyed that this shield isn't die-cast like the Age of Ultron and Civil War versions, and I was as well. In fact, that's one of the reasons that I almost passed on this figure. I've seen how the paint has faded on other plastic shields over time, and I didn't want my own painful story to tell. But for now, with that long-term concern aside, for now, I have to say, I love how this shield looks. The sculpt and the straps, of course, they're familiar to other representations we've got so far, as is the paintwork, but it's the weathering on this version. The weathering it's next level. It's not battle damage per se, it's more weathered, and I love how this looks in his hand and in mine. Speaking of hands, in this pose we're using two of the same sculpts, each with the ability to hold accessories. Each hand can hold the shield, or as you see in his right hand, his empty helmet. This is the same sculpt as the one shown in the full head sculpt, and the paint app is beautifully weathered. While I'll likely pose Cap with the other sculpt the majority of the time, this accessory is so good and it's so well done, and it allows you to take advantage of the most impressive accessory he comes with, the head sculpt. As always, when it comes to Hot Toys, the head sculpt is what gets the praise or causes the biggest commotion in the collecting community. And while the Civil War head sculpt was really good in and of itself, in fact, I didn't know it could get much better, Hot Toys went out and gave us this. And this is one of those head sculpts that has me scratching my own head. How can Hot Toys miss so bad and give us sculpts that barely look like these actors' stunt doubles, and then give us sculpts that look like this, like the real person that's just been shrunk down to 1/6 scale? This sculpt is all new and it's flawless. The paint app is as lifelike as you can get, down to the shape of and highlights in his hair and his complexion. I really don't know what else to say. This is Hot Toys showing off. This is Steve Rogers. This is Chris Evans. And so, for a rating of this Steve Rogers head sculpt, personally, I'd give this sculpt a perfect 10 out of 10. Here we have Cap in a pose reminiscent of the scene in Endgame where he picks up his broken shield and heads back to take on Thanos alone. This pose is made possible by using a couple of the accessories that Cap comes with. The first one is obviously his broken shield. This shield sparked frustration amongst collectors when it was originally seen in the D23 release, as the straps were positioned in the wrong place, and as a result, the shield wasn't movie accurate. Hot Toys caught their error and thankfully addressed it prior to this release. While the broken shield itself would have likely been enough to satisfy collectors, Hot Toys went ahead and gave us two pieces of the shield that have been broken off as accents to the pose, and I'm so glad that they did. You can piece these three pieces together, and if you do, you'll see that they line up perfectly. Another accessory to point out in this pose is another one of the hands that he comes with. There is only one of this variant, and it's on par with the others in terms of sculpt and paintwork. And in terms of paintwork, that's my one gripe with this broken shield. It's not as weathered in terms of paint detail as the full shield is, which doesn't make sense in terms of continuity. That nitpick aside, the overall look of this broken shield is amazing, and while I don't intend to use it in my display as it's a little too scene specific for my personal approach, I can see a lot of collectors and photographers taking advantage of this display option, and rightfully so. The last thing I want to point out in this pose is the first of two interchangeable magnetic mouth plates. This one is a new sculpt and is perfect for capturing that moment when Cap tightened his shield and headed back into the fray. The sculpt is on par with the others, as is the paint detail, especially in the teeth, which is often hit and miss with these types of expressions. Overall, I think this look reflects that moment in the film perfectly, and again, I can see some form of this pose being represented on a lot of collector shelves. Here we have Cap in a more dynamic pose, trying to capture that moment in the film where Cap revealed that he was worthy and he wielded Mjolnir and the entire theater went bonkers, and you know you did too. And while that's an iconic moment and the accessories shown here certainly give us opportunity to recreate that iconic moment, the limitations of this figure don't exactly allow us to do that moment justice. Can you push the boundaries and limitations to achieve it? Probably, but as for me, the long-term concerns I have for this figure aren't worth it. First up, let's look at the lower body. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you know that I don't tend to use stands unless they're for flight poses, and the reason for that is I personally feel like it takes away from the realism of the figures. So I always try to put the figures in poses that they can accommodate on their own. As was the issue with the Civil War version of Cap, this figure has a hard time standing on his own 2 feet. With this particular release, it's due in large part to the material choice in the pants more than the feet and ankles themselves. The material is very restrictive. The legs don't pivot very well, and I couldn't get them to bend enough in each area to exact a more realistic stance. The boots did a nice job of staying flat on the ground, which was a nice compromise for me in landing on this overall position. Moving up, we see a nice crunch in the midsection, which helps with the overall realism, but there isn't as much movement in the turn at the waist as I would have wanted. The left shoulder extends to create a nice line in the arm and shield extension, but the right shoulder reveals the limited upper range of motion, and it's not as much as I would have hoped for. Looking down the right arm, you can see the bend in the elbow, and while the articulation is aided by the material that they used in those joints, you can see how the elbow pads separate from the material, and I'm concerned that a long-term pose like this will cause the pads to come off completely. But who needs elbow pads when you've got Mjolnir? And this is a worthy accessory for this release. Yes, it's plastic, but the paint app is updated from previous versions, and it does a marvelous job of looking like metal. The details in the sculpt are impeccable, and again, while this is too scene specific for a pose in my personal collection, I can see a lot of people taking advantage of this accessory. The last thing to point out in this pose is the second of the two interchangeable mouthpieces. We've seen this one before, and of the two, I feel that this one is the weaker of the two. The paint app is improved over previous versions, but for me, something is lost in the sculpt itself. I don't see Chris Evans in this look, and I don't see myself using this version in my display. It's amazing how something so small could garner such a reaction in the collecting community, but that's exactly what happened when we initially saw this World War II compass in the D23 release. It was so small and so out of proportion, but thankfully, like the straps on the shoulders and the orientation of the shield, Hot Toys addressed the issue with this compass, and now it's in proper scale. And I'm so glad that they fixed this, because of all the accessories Endgame Cap comes with, this is one that I can see making it onto my shelf. Yes, it's a tiny accessory, but I intend to use this and that incredible head sculpt with my civilian cap. The compass articulates in the middle so it can close up, but I plan to use it as shown here with an open hand, and I love how this looks. The detail on such a tiny accessory is on point, but more than that, I think this is a subtle accessory that will add an element of realism and emotion to my display. Out of all the characters in the MCU, it can be argued that Captain America is not just one of, but is the most important and influential. And regardless of where you land on that debate, I think everyone would agree that Captain America is essential to any Marvel collection. That said, I have to confess that as a lifelong comic reader, Captain America has always been one of my least favorite characters, and that's been true of him in the MCU as well. So when I looked at my collection, as I said, I was comfortable with the Civil War version I had, and as a result, I almost passed on this release. But after a quick unboxing and now a more detailed look, I have to say, while I'm not a Captain America fan, this is the Captain America I saw growing up, and I enjoyed the evolution of this look in the films and the culmination of that journey and how it's represented in this iconic look. Yes, there are a few limitations with this release, but the improvements made over previous releases and the ability to recreate so many memorable moments make this, in my opinion, the definitive cap for any Marvel collector. I can do this all day, but all in all, after looking at Captain America and everything he comes with, I'd rate this figure a total 9 out of 10. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you want to stay tuned for more. If so, take a second and hit that subscribe button. There'll be more 6-scale figures and diorama reviews coming your way. Until then, stay safe and collect because you can.